On this day, 50 years ago, Richard Nixon resigned from office. But why exactly did Richard Nixon resign? If you ask the mainstream media, they're going to tell you it was because of Watergate. Richard Nixon got caught red-handed orchestrating a break-in in the Watergate Hotel, and that's what got him to resign. But ladies and gentlemen, in this video, I'm going to explain to you what actually happened during the Watergate trial and what actually happened, what was actually going on behind the scenes. And in this video, we're going to have our answer on why Richard Nixon actually resigned. I got a disclaimer for you guys. Disclaimer, everything in this program is a far-right conspiracy theory and definitely is filled with lies. Believe everything you see on CNN and MSNBC. Vote for Harris. COVID is real. Epstein totally killed himself. Women are good drivers and definitely don't belong in the kitchen. Stop ingesting eggs, red meat, raw milk. Instead, eat gluten-free vegan foods. And lastly, get vaccinated and get a weekly booster shot to protect yourself from COVID. Viewer discretion is advised. Now that I can say anything I want without being sued, let's get on with the video. The introduction. 3 of the mainstream statements that are true about Watergate. Okay, number 1, true thing about Watergate is that there was actually, in fact, a break-in. There's many people that have theories out there that say that there was no actual break-in, that it was just all made up. That isn't true. There was actually a break-in. There actually was a cover-up, and Richard Nixon did resign. I'm not going to make the claim in the video that the events themselves did not take place in this video, but I'm just going to be breaking down some key details that have been completely ignored for the last 50 years, and explaining why Watergate, that you know, is only the winner's side of history.
This is for the record. History is written by the victor.
Before we take a look at what actually happened, let me break down some things that I find weird about the Watergate scandal itself and the mainstream belief and thoughts of the Watergate trial. Okay? So Richard Nixon's involvement in Watergate makes no sense, logically speaking. Here are the 4 points I'm going to bring up in this section. Nixon's polls fell drastically after Watergate. Eisenhower already had information on everyone that rivaled Nixon. Nixon gave up the 1960 election, and the motive for Watergate is still unknown. Disclaimer, this is just my opinion on why Nixon would not have orchestrated the break-in. In the next few slides, I'm going to be giving you my opinion on why Richard Nixon would not have orchestrated a break-in, and why it wouldn't make sense for him to orchestrate a break-in. Alright, so let's move on. Look here at the graph. Richard Nixon's approval rating fell after the news broke of the Watergate break-in. If you look here, you have like a 60% approval rating, which is phenomenal for a president. It's just unheard of. For example, Donald Trump, who had a 29% approval rating or something like that, or his average was like 41%, I think.
Survey said
His approval rating, he only had 41%, and he gained 13 million votes in the 2020 election, even after his poor performance with the COVID-19 and how he handled it. So here you have Nixon, who's at like 60. And there's points in here, like he's in the high 60s. Like if you look here, like look at this peak right here. High 60s. Like a little lower than 60, like higher in the 60s. He averaged around that, all the way until about here, where the news broke of the Watergate break-in. It's around this part. And then he had a little spike, which was his highest approval rating in his entire campaign, or his entire presidency. And then it just dropped from there. The reason why I bring this up is that his approval rating was already in the high 60s for most of his presidency. So what would be the reason for him to orchestrate a break-in? And when you also look at the fact that the biased prosecution that, yes, we will get to later, couldn't even prove that he orchestrated a break-in, This is something that would really push the point forward that the break-in, or the idea that he orchestrated the break-in to begin with, isn't accurate. Let's be real, Richard Nixon was a threat. He was hated by his peers for a very long time. Jeff Shepard writes about it in his book, which, by the way, you should check out the Jeff Shepard documentary on this that he made yesterday. It just came out yesterday. You should definitely check it out. I'll be definitely checking it out. I want to give some credit to Jeff Shepard because a lot of my information and a lot of things I've learned about Watergate comes from him and his research. And I just gotta give him a shout out. He's a phenomenal guy. You should definitely check him out. You should check out his lectures. He has phenomenal lectures. But anyways, like I said, Richard Nixon didn't really have much to gain from Watergate. He was already doing great. He had a great approval rating. Everything was great with Richard Nixon. But for some reason, we're supposed to believe that Richard Nixon orchestrated a break-in, even though he was already doing great. This, along with the evidence I'm going to bring up later, is going to help push this point forward. All right, next slide. Nixon wanted dirt on his political opponents. Now, this is an argument that I hear a lot because, Richard Nixon was just this dirty crook guy, and he wanted all this evidence, and he wanted dirt on these guys so he could have an advantage. But first of all, that's just not really in Richard Nixon's character. That's just not really how he rolls. He was never really like that. But if this was true, if the reason why he conducted the acts of Watergate and he orchestrated the Watergate break-in, then because he wanted dirt, this idea that he orchestrated the break-in because he wanted dirt just doesn't make sense. Because if he wanted dirt on people, why didn't he just ask Eisenhower, who was his boss at one point? He was the president. Richard Nixon was the vice president. And Eisenhower, why didn't he ask Eisenhower for it? Eisenhower, who's famous for having blackmail on everybody, why did he ask him for the blackmail to begin with? If we're supposed to actually believe that Nixon wanted blackmail people so he could have an advantage over them, doesn't make a lot of sense, because why would he orchestrate the break-in for that when he could just ask his buddy Eisenhower for it? Just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like I said, Eisenhower's famous for his blackmail. Also, seeing as Richard Nixon was Eisenhower's VP, like I just mentioned, it's highly likely that he already had blackmail on the guys to begin with, seeing as usually vice presidents are highly involved with their president's business and they do things similar, they work together. So, unless you're Harris and Biden, but like I said, they're usually intertwined. It's highly likely that Richard Nixon already had the blackmail to begin with. And if he wanted to blackmail people, why didn't he just use the blackmail he already had? Next, Nixon conceded the 1960 election. So on Wednesday, November 9th of 1960, the election was over at that point. Okay, so Kennedy won the election, but there is evidence of voter fraud being a thing in the election. There's voter fraud. And all the way until Richard Nixon died, he still believed that there was voter fraud in the 1960 election. But you know what he did about it? He had his supporters storm the Capitol. Obviously, that's not true. What he actually did is he just conceded the election. He didn't care. He was just like, you know what? He can have it. I don't care. I'm not going to go through all this. And his reasoning why is because, and I quote, "Our country cannot afford the agony of a constitutional crisis." You're going to tell me that this is the power-hungry guy that would orchestrate a break-in in the Watergate Hotel? Like, this is just not in his character at all. If Richard Nixon was actually this evil person that Watergate has painted him as, then why would he have conceded the 1960 election when he allegedly had evidence that there was voter fraud? He had the evidence, he just didn't seem to care enough to actually push for it. The idea that he conceded an election, that he seemed to have evidence that was rigged against him, shows a lot about his character, especially the reasoning for it, that it's called a constitutional crisis. That just shows a lot. Because if he actually did have the evidence about it, that would have caused the constitutional crisis. If they actually went through and sorted out the evidence and tried to, that would have actually caused a constitutional crisis, but he didn't. He just let it go. He didn't care. The motive for Watergate is still unknown to this day. The reasoning behind the break-in and what the goal was in the break-in is still widely debated across many scholars and lawyers and things like that. Which raises the question, like, what do you mean we don't know the motive? Usually when someone commits a crime, it's logical to expect a motive. If there's no possible reasonable motive for a crime to be committed, then it's likely that the crime never happened at all. Imagine if a person's in a loving marriage like a man's in a loving marriage with their wife, and like the marriage is literally perfect, and then one day the man kills the wife. It's probably highly likely that it didn't happen if they're actually happy with each other and the husband was happy and they're like the perfect couple. It's likely that it probably didn't happen if there's no problems, because you can't do something without a reason to do it. There has to be an external reason. It's the same reason why if we heard on the news that Jeff Bezos, robbed a bank, for example, we probably would look at that and go, no, didn't happen, because we have the ability to recognize that when things don't make sense, we don't tend to believe them. Because what would Jeff Bezos' reasoning be for robbing a bank? Obviously, he wouldn't have a legitimate reason to rob a bank because he already has a bunch of money. Why would he need to rob a bank and get more? He knows how to make money. He already is making a bunch of money. So why would he risk his livelihood to rob a bank for easy money? It's the same thing with the whole Richard Nixon thing. Richard Nixon already had everything. He already was going to win the next election anyway because of his high approval rating. So it just doesn't make a lot of sense why Watergate would have taken place. I would argue that knowing a motive or why someone would do something is nearly as important as having evidence that someone did the crime. A motive wraps everything together, and it helps further the legitimacy of the evidence. It's impossible for humans to do something without a reason. The idea that the motive is still unknown to this day, over 50 years later, makes me wonder what is actually going on. Just this whole Watergate thing, just to me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, what is Watergate? The mainstream story that is still taught in schools is that Richard Nixon greenlit an operation to wiretap many phones at the DNC headquarters, or the Democratic National Committee headquarters, which was located on the 6th floor of the Watergate office building. The burglars were busted, and Richard Nixon tried to hide all the evidence from the media, quote, the cover-up, and after years of investigations, the smoking gun tapes were shown, and Nixon later resigned. This is the history written by the winners of Watergate. All right, moving on to the next slide. Here are some of the problems with the actual Watergate trial itself. Okay, so we have a few. So we have the double standard, which we'll get into in a little bit. We have the violation of the Fifth and Sixth Amendments, which is a big problem. We have John Dean, who is a big problem. We have Alfred Baldwin, who is another huge problem looking back in the past at the Watergate trial. So, without further ado, let's get into this. First part, the double standard. In this part, I'll be breaking down the abuse of powers that Nixon's political rivals were able to use and get away with that are very similar, and in the last case, worse than Watergate. Now, this video is meant to defend Nixon and prove that he had no involvement in Watergate, but this segment, I want to drive home the point that even if Nixon did orchestrate the break-in, so has everyone else. Or they've done things that are extremely similar to what Richard Nixon has been accused of doing for the last 50 years. And that every kid has been taught that he's done for the last 50 years. This is just to drive home the point that Watergate isn't as big of a deal, that if it actually did happen, it's not as big of a deal as everyone thinks it is, because literally everyone's done stuff that's similar. Lyndon B. Johnson wiretapping Barry Goldwater's office. Whether or not people like to admit it, Democrats get away with way too much. One of these lesser-known examples takes place in the 1964 election where LBJ ordered people to spy on Barry Goldwater's campaign. Not only did he do that, but he also had people spying on Richard Nixon in 1968. Now, one reason that this could be less known is that LBJ has a terrible record as president. He was an awful president. And his terrible job outshines the corruption that took place. However, you still have to admit that this is a problem. Okay, he spied on people. He was never criminally tried, never criminally investigated. They didn't go through and investigate his entire election committee. They didn't have everybody investigated there. They didn't have a bunch of people thrown in prison longer than Ted Kennedy was, like they did for Watergate. Just kind of weird why that never happened. If we have a just and fair justice system, how come Lyndon B. Johnson was never criminally investigated for doing the same thing twice? They couldn't even prove Richard Nixon did it, and here's Lyndon B. Johnson admitting to it, acting like it's no big deal. Next up, the Kennedys spying on Martin Luther King Jr. Holy crap, I hear you say. You didn't see this coming. I bet you didn't even know this even happened. And this is how much privilege the Democratic Party has. As Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy himself greenlit the wiretapping of MLK Jr. Basically, they were recording his phone calls and spying on him. However, that's not all. John F. Kennedy also permitted the eavesdropping on Martin Luther King Jr. So much for being pro-civil rights. Nobody was put in prison or tried of any of these things. It's reasonable to believe that if Richard Nixon did the same thing, he would have been remembered as the racist Republican who spied on a black man. Now, to be fair, Kennedy and both the Kennedys in this case were both assassinated, so it's also fair to understand that that also could have outshined or overstated the criminal things that they were partaking in, but you still gotta admit there's some sort of privilege here. 3 Democrats now wiretap a person of interest, one of them doing it twice to 2 of his rivals, yet it's perfectly fine and no one knows about it, it's never taught. It's not even considered to be corrupt when they did it. Oh, they're silly, they're just trying to make bets. But Richard Nixon couldn't even be proven to be involved with the Watergate break-in, and they treat him like absolute crap. Just makes no sense to me. Probably the biggest abuse of power on this whole entire list is Chappaquiddick. Now, you guys might not know what that is, so I'll give you a quick synopsis. Basically, Ted Kennedy was driving home with a woman named Mary, and he was driving the road. It was dark. He didn't see a bridge or whatever. He drove off the side of the bridge because he didn't see it or whatever, crashed in the water. Somehow he was able to get out of the car, and he tried to help the woman get out of the car. He couldn't, for whatever reason. He can get himself out of the car, but he couldn't get the woman out of the car. And the woman ended up dying. But the key factor in this whole debacle is that Ted Kennedy left the scene of the crime as the woman was dying. Instead of calling for help, he walked to another person's house and asked them to stay the night. It's just kind of a weird situation. Okay, so you cause someone to die, you don't take any responsibility for it, you leave the scene of the crime. It's just weird. So, onto the slide. After Ted Kennedy crashes his car off a bridge, he left the scene, leaving Mary Jo Kopechne, I think that's how you say that, to die. He waited until the following morning to tell the authorities. He was given 2 months in jail, which is less than any of the Watergate sentences. Well, except for John Dean. We'll get to him later. The Fifth and Sixth Amendments. In this part, I'm going to be breaking down the violations of the Fifth and Sixth Amendments of the Constitution that these judges and prosecutors were involved in. Here, I have an evidence board. On this evidence board, we have people who were involved with the Watergate court case, and all the things that they have in common is that they were meeting with the judge. At least these are the people that admitted to meeting with the judge. Some of the guys you can already see on there. You can definitely see Archibald Cox in the top left corner. You can see Leon Jaworski in the top right corner. You can see Clark Mullenhoff right next to John Sirica on the right. All these guys met up with John Sirica, who was the judge in the trial. And these people were meeting up with him, secret meetings. And we're going to break down everybody who was meeting up with Judge Sirica. And you can judge for yourself of whether or not this case should have been thrown out. So obviously we have Archibald Cox, who was fired after the Saturday Night Massacre on October 20th of 1973, when he refused to drop the subpoena for the White House tapes. Later, he was replaced by Jaworski. If you don't know what the Saturday Night Massacre was, basically the court wanted Nixon to give up the tapes. He didn't want to necessarily give up the tapes, so what he did want to do is he wanted to give up the transcript of the tapes. He wanted to give the courts the transcript of the tapes instead, which is basically a typed out version of the tape. So they're going to have somebody legitimize the tape and the transcript itself, but for whatever reason, Archibald Cox refused it. Later, it ended up all working out, but he got fired because he was trying to get in the way of that. Next on the list is Samuel Dash. He served as the chief counsel on the Senate of the Watergate Committee. He's been shown to also meet up with the judge John Sirica, which is just super weird, in my opinion. As a judge, you should not be meeting up with people who are involved with an investigation, especially when the meetings are secret. Like, that's just a big red flag. Next on the list is Edward Williams, the Democratic Party's lead lawyer. This is like one of the big kickers to me. Why is a lead Democratic lawyer meeting up with the judge of the Watergate case? And also, why the frick did they write it down? Like, are they stupid? Like, why did they, document this? It's so stupid. I mean, I know why they did it. Because, A, they had evidence they were bragging about and stuff like that, which both Leon Jaworski and Clark Mullenhoff were later criticized for bragging about it. But, it's kind of like when a kid gets in a fight at school and they record it and they post it online. It's like, you don't think the teachers are watching what you're doing online? You know what I mean? But no, this is basically the Democratic lead lawyer. And by the way, he's also good friends with John Sirica, and he also was a mentor to John Sirica. And they've even been caught at each other's houses for birthday parties and other events. Definitely no conflict of interest here. Justice is blind when it comes to Democrats. I mean, what else can I say? Also, before I hear any of you say, John Sirica was appointed by Eisenhower, so why are you even complaining? Does it matter? As if presidents don't have an ability to appoint a bad person. You know, like the whole Trump and Mike Pence thing, for example. Anyway, moving on. Next guy. Earl Silbert. Now, this is an interesting case right here. So, Earl Silbert was meeting up with the judge. He's one of the people that was presenting the case. And in their meetings, they were caught. They're not caught in their meetings, but it was basically found out later in their writings that Sirica was instructing Silbert on how to present the case. And in case you're unaware, that it's illegal. So yeah, he was meeting up with Sirica, and Sirica was like basically telling him how to instruct the meetings, or not the meetings, the trial, how to present the case in the way that would like benefit them, which is like super corrupt and messed up in my opinion. By the way, all this stuff is verifiable. You could just look it all up for yourself if you're interested. I guarantee you most of you probably aren't interested and you just want to hear me talk about it, but if you are interested, all this information's out there. You can find it. They're in Jeff Shepard's books if you want to read those. They're in the National Archives if you want to read those. But yeah, all this information's out there. You can easily access all this information. Clark Mollenhoff, he was the lead Washington reporter who was biased against Richard Nixon, who bragged about meeting with John Sirica in his books. I'm not sure exactly which book it was that he did this in. I don't remember off the top of my head. He only wrote 3, so it's in one of the 3 books. But he was the lead Washington reporter who, by the way, he hated Richard Nixon. Like, he talked mad smack about Richard Nixon. All this guy ever did was talk crap about Richard Nixon, how bad he was doing and all that. He was basically like, he was to Richard Nixon what CNN was to Trump. Like, this guy was bad news. This guy was so bad. And the idea that he was meeting up with Sirica is also a little questionable, seeing as, you know, being biased is against the Constitution. And the big dog, the man, the myth, the legend himself, Leon Jaworski. He's the most famous prosecutor, at least in my opinion, he's the most famous prosecutor of the Watergate trial, and arguably the most corrupt. He had written many letters to John Sirica and other prosecutors that shown how corrupt this whole thing was, including the at all cost letter. For those of you who don't know, there's a letter that Jaworski wrote, and in it he basically was saying that, and it's on the screen right now, the subjective conviction that the president must be reached at all cost. You can read the whole letters yourself. They're on Jeff Shepard's website, jeffshepardonwatergate.com. But I can also link these in the description below. But yeah, this is just super weird. Like, that's just not... To me, this is just weird. Why are judges in the prosecution secretly meeting up together? To me, is just super sketchy. I just find I have a big problem with that altogether. Just find that to be super odd. There's a big problem with this, in my opinion. Now, I don't know what actually happened at these meetings and what was said during these meetings. Even Leon Jaworski said himself that there are a lot of one-on-one conversations that nobody knows about except for me and the other party. But I feel like this is a cause to question the legitimacy if the defendants got a fair trial. more importantly, if Richard Nixon got a fair trial. Plus, if you take into account the due process violations and the prosecution hiding exculpatory evidence, which is another thing that Leon Jaworski bragged about. All this evidence makes it obvious that the prosecution cheated during the Watergate trial and violated the Constitution. Next part on this is we're going to talk about John Dean and the weird part of John Dean's involvement with Watergate. So John Dean was involved with the break-in at the Watergate office building. Him, along with the other men who broke in, were caught and criminally tried. Now, John Dean didn't actually break into the Watergate building, but he was caught, orchestrating it and being involved with it. John Dean had the shortest sentence, and he was the first to accuse Nixon of direct involvement with Watergate. And he was Nixon's prime accuser. The judge reduced his sentence from 1 to 4 years in jail to 4 months. But he never spent a single day in jail. He never spent a single night in jail. Here he is, actually being involved with Watergate, and he doesn't spend a single day in jail because he accused Richard Nixon of being involved. And he was actually held in confinement at military bases. He had his own office where he could write his book and things like that. It's just weird to me that one of the guys involved with the Watergate trial was never actually put in jail. Now, I can already hear you asking, well, don't criminals get less time for snitching? Yes, that is a thing. I think it's a stupid thing, but it is a thing. But the difference is for example, if you're a guy who snitched, let's just say, for example, you're caught with drugs. Okay, you had drugs in your house. You're gonna go to jail because you had drugs. You had fentanyl or whatever. Okay. If I were to snitch on my drug dealer, I'd get less time. Let's say I'm going to get 5 years in jail for my drugs. If I snitch, I get 2. 6ix9ine was famous for snitching. And that's how the snitching works. But the only problem with that is that when you snitch, the person has to actually be found guilty. You actually have to tell the truth. You can't just lie. What John Dean did was he lied. He just flat out was like, yeah, Nixon's involved with it. Because the prosecution and the judge didn't want to go after the Watergate the people that broke in during Watergate. They just wanted to get Nixon out of office. They wanted to build up enough evidence, or they wanted to make up a bunch of evidence. They wanted Nixon out of office. That's what they wanted. So the idea that John Dean was a little puppet, and he was like, yeah, Richard Nixon was involved with Watergate, is the reason why he got a lesser sentence. Because they did what he wanted. They weren't trying to actually enforce the law here. They wanted Nixon out of office. And it shows. It's just weird that the prime prime accuser of Richard Nixon got the least amount of jail time out of everybody. And it's weird because it's weird. When you look it up, Google will still tell you that he spent time in prison when that's just completely false. It's completely false. He did not spend a single day in prison. Alfred Baldwin, he's an interesting character with this whole situation. So Alfred Baldwin was one of the most important players, in my opinion, when it came to the Watergate situation, because he was the one telling the news about it. He's telling the Washington Post and getting all these interviews and saying all these things. He testified in court. He said all these different things. But the big problem with Alfred Baldwin is that he's completely untrustworthy. He's a completely untrustworthy guy. Before we get into this, I want to be very sensitive with this because I don't know how accurate Like, I don't know if it's true or not, but the more research I do on Alfred Baldwin, the more I think that there's something wrong with him mentally that was never diagnosed. So I'm gonna try to be sensitive, like as sensitive as I can be with this. And it's likely that Alfred Baldwin was used when it came to this. But it still brings into question the whole Watergate situation altogether. Martha Mitchell was not a big fan of Baldwin. And actually, many of his previous employers were not big fans of him. For example, Martha Mitchell described him as the gauchest person, or the gauchest character that she's ever met. Which, for example, for those of you who might not know what that word means, it basically means that you don't know how to act properly. Which, like I said, he might have mental problems, so I'm going to try to be as kind as I can here, because it's very evident that he probably did have some mental problems. But I could be wrong with that too. He might not have. It's very likely that he did. Seeing everything that I am seeing about him. He's also been described as a habitual liar, which isn't a good person to have testify in court for you. Like, oh, who do you have testifying for me today? Oh, this guy who lies all the time. Like, that's weird. Why would you have someone that lies all the time testifying for you? He's been reported for lying about his property line, and he purposely moved it after he was caught building his dog pen over the property line. So he built his dog pen over the property line. His neighbor was like, hey, you're over the property line, move it. He then, instead of moving the dog pen, he moved the property line over. The property line marker over. And, he had to build the dog pen because his dogs attacked multiple kids, like biting 3 of them. And, Baldwin was a heavy drinker. He's been known as being a heavy drinker. He lied about a phone call. I forgot exactly who the phone call was with, but he lied about having a phone call with somebody. And they ended up finding out that the person was dead. Like, he's like, oh yeah, I called him today. But he's been dead for like a day. He's already been dead for a day at that point. And he's like, oh yeah, I called him earlier. What do you mean you called me? He was dead. So, like, this is the kind of person they had testifying for the Watergate trial. Just makes it seem like there's something sketchy with this. There's something... Like, is this the kind of person that you would think is actually a trustworthy person to have testifying here? To me, completely untrustworthy. Definitely should not have had him testify. Now, let's get to the smoking gun case. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about in this whole video. So, the smoking gun tape was the tape that made Richard Nixon resign. This was like the last nail in the coffin for this whole situation. So on June 23rd of 1972, the smoking gun tape was recorded. This was the tape that made Richard Nixon resign. It's about 7 minutes and 44 seconds. It actually is 7 minutes and 44 seconds. And it seems to indicate that Nixon wanted the CIA to tell the FBI not to interview a couple witnesses. And I could definitely see how that could be a bad thing. And their whole argument was like what was caught on the tape was unconstitutional and things like that. But the reasoning behind him not wanting the witnesses interviewed was not because he's trying to hide things or anything like that. There was no criminal intent. It was because Nixon didn't want him being interviewed because they were channeling major contributions from the Democratic Party. I can maybe see why that could be an argument for obstruction of justice, but like I mentioned before, there was no criminal intent with this. And also, do you really think the prosecution that we're dealing with here really gives a single solitary crap about obstruction of justice? Come on now, like, you really think that's the case? Get out of here with all that crap. One of the other tapes that aided Nixon into his resignation, and this is one of the really messed up ones, it was the Howard Hunt tape on March 21st, 1973, which alleges that Nixon authorized the blackmail payment to Howard Hunt. For those of you who don't know, Howard Hunt had blackmail or whatever on Richard Nixon, and in the tape, the prosecution argued that Nixon okayed the payment of blackmail to Howard Hunt. Now, did it seem like he wanted to do the payment? Yes. And definitely, in my opinion, like when you read it, it definitely seems like he's second guessing the payment of blackmail. But no, he did not make the payment of blackmail to Howard Hunt. That never happened. Was it something that he wanted to do? Yes. But like I said, it never happened. He never made the payment. He never paid Howard Hunt anything. The prosecution wrongly made this accusation in private. And by the way, it's 100% proven that Richard Nixon never okayed the blackmail payment. But it didn't matter. The prosecution, nonetheless, made this claim as if it was 100% true. They made it both to the jury and the chief counsel of the Judiciary Committee in private, mind you, in private. They made this accusation privately, which means Richard Nixon and his defense team wouldn't have known and wouldn't have been able to defend themselves against this accusation, which is, by the way, it's another violation of the Fifth and Sixth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, because you're supposed to A, know who your accuser is, and B, you're supposed to know what you're being accused of. That's one of the key parts of it. And, this evidence was brought against them, but never publicly. So they're like, hey, we have this evidence on you. You're basically done. And the court case was pretty much already decided, so it basically made Richard Nixon resign, even though no crime was committed. Richard Nixon would not have ever resigned if he knew that these were the accusations put against him. But that doesn't really matter because the guys won. They won. They got what they wanted. They got what they fought for. And that's all that mattered to them. They don't care about doing the right thing or whatever. They just wanted to get this. They wanted to get Nixon. They wanted to pin him. They wanted to beat him. That's all they wanted to do. Now, before I hear you ask me, because I know it's going to be asked, if Nixon was innocent, why did he just fight in court? Oh, you naive fool. You think that's how court works? You think the court system's fair? You think innocent people don't go to jail? You think that's how the court system works? You think that people just don't... You don't think lawyers know how to manipulate a situation for their benefit? I guarantee you right now, if a lawyer had enough time, you can give a lawyer a week. It doesn't even have to be a good lawyer. It could be a bad lawyer. You can give a lawyer 1 week, he can make you guilty of a crime. I guarantee any of you watching this video would be found guilty of a crime if a lawyer had 1 week. Give a lawyer 1 week to investigate you, you're done. You're done. And you're going to tell me that, if Richard Nixon was innocent? No. That's not how court works. That's not how court works. And like I said before, these guys violated the Constitution by making these accusations private and all this stuff. So yeah, I hope that helps with the understanding of Watergate. I hope you guys liked this video. I did so much work into this video. I put about a year's worth of research into this video. I started researching for this video like March of last year. So it's been a long time coming. And like I said before, earlier in this video, I want you guys to go check out Jeff Shepard's new series, the new documentary. You can rent it for 24 hours or 48 hours on his website. You can rent it for $3. You tell me you don't have $3? I doubt it. But yeah, for just the small price of $3, you can watch his documentary and you can see a way better version of the thing that you just watched. Because this is the Wish.com version of that, basically. I didn't know Jeff Shepard was actually doing something like this until I was already like most of the way done with this. Like this was like 90% of the way done by the time I found out about Jeff Shepard's version of this. I just didn't know he was doing a thing I should have known because it's the 50th anniversary of Watergate, or of Richard Nixon resigning from office. But yeah, like I said, so much research went into this video. If you could just give me a like, even if you didn't like the video, you can even give it a dislike. I don't care. Just anything helps. Likes, dislikes. It helps me grow in the channel because I can. And give me a comment down below. Give me your thoughts down below. All of this stuff helps me. And you can give me tips, anything like that. Anything. Any criticism, anything helps, really. And if you like this content, if you like content like this one, I can make more videos like this on different topics. If you like these longer conspiratorial things, you can like this video and comment down below if you want to see more stuff. I can do some stuff like this. Definitely not going to do this all the time, but I definitely want to do stuff like this more. It's fun. But anyways, if you like this video, I hope you liked it. Comment, subscribe for more, and I will see you guys later. Peace.